In 1937, IBM printed a corporate hymnal, over 100 songs praising the company and its CEO Thomas Watson by name, and employees were expected to sing them at meetings well into the 1970s. If you think Michael Scott's forced fun at Dunder Mifflin was peak office cringe, real corporate America was far worse. Mandatory personality tests, loyalty oaths, your wife interviewed to determine if she was corporate material. Dunder Mifflin looks downright progressive by comparison. And the strangest part is just how normal all of this was considered. Here's what most people believe. They believe The Office is an exaggeration, a comedy that takes the mild awkwardness of real office life and stretches it to absurd extremes for laughs. Michael Scott's diversity day training, his prison mic routine, his bizarre obsession with being everyone's best friend, these are supposed to be satire, parody, a funhouse mirror held up to the American workplace that distorts everything just enough to make it funny. And layered beneath that is an even more comfortable assumption that offices used to be better, more professional, more dignified. We picture the mid-century American office as a place of quiet competence, men in grey flannel suits doing serious work, mahogany desks, a secretary who actually respected her boss, maybe a 3-martini lunch. That's the Golden Age narrative. The idea that corporate America used to have standards and somewhere along the way, we lost them. This myth is seductive. It shows up in how people talk about Mad Men, in how they romanticize the old economy, in how they assume that the cringe of The Office must be a modern invention. It is almost entirely wrong. The real offices of the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s weren't more dignified. They were more controlling, more invasive, and more psychologically demanding than anything Michael Scott ever dreamed up. And we have the documentation to prove it. In 1956, journalist William White published a book called The Organization Man. It became a bestseller because it described something millions of white-collar workers already knew but had never seen written down. Major American corporations weren't just hiring people to do jobs. They were engineering a specific type of human being. The centerpiece of this system was the personality test. Companies like Sears, General Electric, and Standard Oil administered psychological assessments to job applicants, not to find the most talented candidates, but to find the most conformist ones. These weren't simple questionnaires. Some companies used instruments based on the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, a clinical tool originally designed to diagnose psychiatric disorders. They asked questions like, do you sometimes feel that you are about to go to pieces? And, are you sometimes the leader of a group? And, do you prefer to be alone most of the time? The correct answers were not subtle. Companies wanted candidates who showed high sociability, low individualism, moderate ambition, but not too much. And above all, a deep comfort with group consensus. If your personality profile showed signs of independent thinking or strong creative drive, that was a red flag. White actually published a guide in his book teaching applicants how to fake the right answers, and it became one of the most popular chapters. Think about that for a moment. Dunder Mifflin never once administered a personality test to weed out anyone too interesting. Michael Scott hired people based on vibes and whether they laughed at his jokes. By mid-century corporate standards, that was practically meritocratic. And once you passed the personality test, the conformity didn't stop. At IBM, there was an unwritten but universally enforced dress code that mandated white shirts. Not light blue, not cream. White, dark suits. Conservative ties. One former IBM employee from the 1960s recalled that wearing a blue shirt to the office generated the same reaction you might expect from showing up without pants. The company didn't need to write the rule down. The culture enforced it with a precision that would make Dwight Schrute weep with admiration. Now let's talk about those IBM songs, because they deserve more than a passing mention. The corporate songbook was called Songs of the IBM, and it was not a joke. It was a professionally printed, hardbound collection of original compositions with titles like Ever Onward, Our IBM Managers, and This Is Real. To Thomas J. Watson, We All Stand and Sing. Employees gathered at company events and sang these songs together. Regional managers led the singing. New hires learned the words during orientation, and IBM was not alone. National Cash Register had its own company songs in the early 20th century and carried the tradition forward for decades. Hundreds of corporations had some version of organized group enthusiasm, whether it was company cheers, motivational rallies, or mandatory attendance at rah-rah conferences that looked more like revival meetings than business events. During the Cold War, this corporate culture gained an additional layer, the loyalty oath. Federal employees had been subject to loyalty screenings since the late 1940s, but private companies adopted their own versions. Defense contractors, banks, and major industrial firms required employees to sign statements affirming their loyalty to American values, their rejection of communist ideology, and, in some cases, their personal moral character. Refusing to sign wasn't technically illegal, it just meant you didn't get the job, or you lost the one you had. Michael Scott once made his employees participate in a fire safety seminar that ended with Dwight starting a real fire. It was chaotic, it was dangerous, but at no point did he require anyone to sign a document swearing ideological allegiance to Dunder Mifflin. He never even asked. Here's where it gets truly invasive. Many major corporations in the 1950s and 1960s didn't just evaluate employees. They evaluated their wives. This was standard practice at companies like IBM, General Electric, and many banks and consulting firms. When a man was being considered for a management position, the company would arrange a dinner or social event where his wife would be observed and assessed. Was she poised? Did she drink too much? Could she host a dinner party for clients? Did she seem likely to cause problems or embarrass the company? Some firms conducted explicit interviews with wives, asking about their social habits, their feelings about relocation, and whether they supported their husband's career above all else. The writer Vance Packard documented this in his 1962 book, The Pyramid Climbers. He described a corporate culture where a man's promotion could be blocked because his wife was too opinionated or not a good fit. One executive told Packard that the most important quality in a manager's wife was her willingness to move anywhere at any time without complaint. And move they did. Corporate relocation was not a request, it was an expectation. IBM employees joked that the company's initials stood for "I've been moved." Families were uprooted every 2 to 3 years, transferred across the country to prove loyalty and flexibility. Refusing a transfer was a career-ending decision. Your personal preferences, your children's school, your aging parents, none of it mattered as much as the company's organizational chart. Now think about the office. Pam Beasley's personal life was messy and complicated, and Michael occasionally inserted himself into it in uncomfortable ways. But at no point did Dunder Mifflin formally interview Jim Halpert to determine whether Pam was a suitable corporate spouse. The very idea sounds like a deleted scene that was too absurd even for the show. In real life, it was Tuesday, so let's run the comparison honestly. Michael Scott was needy, inappropriate, and occasionally offensive. He made his employees participate in pointless meetings, subjected them to bad improv, and once forced everyone to watch a homemade movie where he was the star. He was exhausting, but here's what Michael Scott never did. He never required a psychological evaluation to confirm you thought like everyone else. He never made you sing a company anthem. He never demanded you sign a document swearing your ideological loyalty to a paper supply company. He never evaluated your spouse. He never transferred you across the country on a whim and told you your career depended on saying yes. He never fired someone for wearing the wrong color shirt. The managers of real mid-century corporate America did all of these things, routinely, systematically, and with the full support of the organizational hierarchy. They didn't do it because they were bad people. They did it because the prevailing management philosophy of the era held that the corporation was not just an employer. It was a total institution. It provided your income, your social life, your identity, and your purpose. In return, it expected your complete self. The office works as comedy because it exaggerates the gap between corporate rhetoric and human reality. But the joke lands differently when you realize that real corporate America didn't have a gap. The rhetoric and the reality were the same thing. The company really did expect your soul, and most people really did hand it over. What changed? Partly the economy. The recessions of the 1970s shattered the implicit promise of lifetime employment that made total loyalty seem rational. Partly the counterculture of the 1960s produced a generation of workers who pushed back against conformity. And partly the law. Employment discrimination legislation slowly made some of the most invasive practices, especially wife interviews and personality screenings used as proxies for race and gender, legally risky. But the transition was slow. Many of these practices lingered into the 1980s and beyond in modified forms. The open plan office, the mandatory team-building retreat, the corporate values statement you're required to memorize, these are the fossils of the old system, softened but not gone. So here's the question I want you to fight about in the comments. If you had to choose, would you rather work at Dunder Mifflin under Michael Scott, with all the cringe and chaos that entails, or at IBM in